60-year-old American impregnates 4 nuns in a secret sect in Chile. We were chosen. The first thing Arthur Finch saw was the blue cross. Not a crucifix, not the ornate silver thing that hung in the chapel where the air was thick with the scent of old stone and unlit copal incense, but a stark chemical blue cross in the circular window of a plastic stick. It was the 4th one he'd seen in the last 10 minutes. 4 plastic sticks, laid out in a precise, reverent row on the worn wooden table in the infirmary. 4 positive pregnancy tests. He was 60 years old. His hands, which had once performed miracles of cellular excision, which had tied sutures, finer than a human hair, trembled. A film of sweat, cold and immediate, slicked his forehead under the harsh, high-altitude sun streaming through the window. Outside, the Atacama Desert stretched into an infinite ochre silence, a landscape so alien it felt like the surface of Mars. Inside, the silence was different. It was a living thing, woven from the placid, expectant gazes of the 4 women standing. Before him, Sor Ana, the eldest. Her face a roadmap of sun-etched wrinkles around eyes that held the unwavering certainty of a prophet. Sor Isabel, whose gaze was usually the most direct, the most questioning, now soft and averted, a small, readable smile on her lips. Sor Catalina, barely 20, her cheeks flushed with a beatific glow, her hands clasped over her flat stomach, as if she could already feel the flutter of life. And Sor Sophia, the quietest of them all, who simply watched him, her dark eyes holding a universe of emotions he could never hope to chart. They wore their simple, undyed wool habits, the rough fabric, a stark contrast to the impossible delicacy of the situation. They were nuns, or at least they were what the world would call nuns. Here in the isolated enclave of the Comunidad de la Divina Simiente, the community of the divine seed, they were something else entirely. And he, Arthur Finch, failed oncologist, widower, and fugitive from a life of quiet desperation in Boston, was, what, a collaborator? A messiah? A monster? His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Looked. From the 4 blue crosses to the 4 placid faces, the air was thin at 12,000 feet, but he had never felt so utterly breathless. It was Sor Ana who finally broke the silence, her voice as dry and ancient as the desert itself. Ease. La voluntad de Dios, she said. It is God's will. But Arthur wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Sor Catalina, met his gaze and whispered the words that would become the anthem of his new, terrifying reality, the words that would echo in the coming storm. Alegidas, she breathed, her voice filled with a joy so pure it felt like a judgment. We were chosen. And the question that clawed at Arthur's throat, raw and unspoken, was not how this had happened. He knew how. He had been a participant, willing and yet not, seduced by something far more potent than lust. The question that screamed in the vacuum of the room was, what have I done? 6 months earlier, Arthur Finch had been dying. Not of a disease that could be named or excised, but of a slow, creeping rot of the soul. His world was a 3-bedroom colonial in Brookline, Massachusetts. A house that had become a mausoleum of silence after his wife, Eleanor, had succumbed to the same pancreatic cancer he'd spent 30 years fighting in others. Her scent had faded from the pillows. Her music no longer drifted from the study. All that remained were the ghosts of conversations, the echoes of laughter in rooms that were now just rooms. His work, once a crusade, had become a grim ledger of failures. The faces of his patients haunted him, but none more so than Lily, a 9-year-old girl with eyes the color of a summer sky and a glioblastoma that had defied every scalpel, every round of radiation, every desperate chemotherapeutic cocktail he'd thrown at it. The last time he'd seen her, she was a fragile doll, her bright spirit dimmed by morphine, her skull mapped with the faint blue lines of his surgical failure. Her parents hadn't sued. Their quiet, hollowed-out grief was worse than any lawsuit. It was a mirror, so he'd retired. At 60, he was a man adrift. His colleagues threw him a party with a bad cake and platitudes about a well-deserved rest. Rest was the last thing he wanted. Rest meant silence, and silence meant thinking. started measuring his days in pores of Lafrogue, the smoky peat a welcome scorch that momentarily burned away the memories. He'd sit in his leather armchair, the one Eleanor had always hated, and watch the dust motes dance in the afternoon light, feeling himself turning to dust with them. One night, drunker than he intended, he found himself scrolling through a website for international medical volunteering. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for an exit, a place so remote, so stark, so utterly removed from the comfortable misery of his life that he might simply disappear. He scanned past programs in Ghana, in Vietnam, in Guatemala. Then he saw it. A tiny, underfunded clinic in the Chilean Andes, near a town called San Pedro de Atacama. The description was sparse. Seeking general practitioner for high-altitude community, basic facilities, long-term commitment preferred. The accompanying photo was not of a bustling clinic, but of a vast, empty desert under a sky of impossible. Aching blue dot, it looked like the end of the world. It was perfect. He liquidated his assets, sold the house to a young couple who gushed about the good bones of his tomb, and packed a single suitcase. He told no one where he was going. There was no one left to tell. He bought a one-way ticket. To Santiago, then another to the tiny airport in Calama. From there it was a rattling 90-minute bus ride through a landscape of such profound emptiness that it felt cleansing. Red-brown earth, volcanic cones on the horizon, and a sun that bleached all color from the world. He felt the weight of his old life, the hospital corridors, the beeping machines, the scent of antiseptic and regret evaporating into the dry. Thin air, the clinic was little more than a collection of adobe huts, run by a perpetually harried government nurse who looked at Arthur's credentials with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He was absurdly overqualified, a thoroughbred put out to pasture in a field of rocks. But he worked. He treated altitude sickness, set the broken bones of miners, stitched up machete wounds from drunken brawls, and delivered babies under a single flickering fluorescent bulb. For the first time in years, his skills felt tangible, immediate. He wasn't fighting an insidious cellular enemy. He was patching up the simple, messy business of life. He was tired at the end of the day, a physical exhaustion that finally, blessedly, silenced his mind. It was a month into his tenure that he first encountered the Hermanas. They came to the clinic for medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, quinine. They moved together, a small flock of silent women in their coarse, sand-colored habits. They did not look like any nuns he had ever seen. There were no wimples, no crisp black and white. They looked as if they had sprung from the earth itself. They were led by Sorena, whose authority was absolute and unspoken. She did the talking. Her Spanish formal and precise. Now the others remained in the background, their faces serene and watchful. He was intrigued. The local townspeople spoke of them in hushed, superstitious tones. The Hermanas de la Divina Simiente. They lived in a cloister deep in the Valle de la Luna, the Valley of the Moon, a place of bizarre salt formations and dunes that looked like frozen waves. They had been there for over a century, a sect that had broken from the Catholic Church. Long ago, over a doctrinal dispute no one could quite remember. They kept to themselves, cultivated their gardens in a hidden oasis, and prayed. What they prayed for, no one knew. His first real conversation was with Sor Isabel. She had brought a young boy to him from the village closest to their cloister, his arm broken in a fall. While Arthur set the bone, she stood by, not with the detached piety he expected, but with a sharp, intelligent curiosity. "You were a surgeon," she stated, not asked. Her English was nearly perfect, tinged with an accent he couldn't place. "Long time ago," he said, wrapping the cast. "You do not look like a man who has found peace in this place. You look like a man who is hiding." Her directness was a splash of cold water. "I'm not sure there's a difference." She considered this, her head tilted. "Perhaps not. But one implies you are running from something. Is the other that? You are waiting for something." He finished his work and looked at her. Her face, framed by the simple woolen hood, was beautiful in a severe, unadorned way. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that saw too much. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since Eleanor was alive, a connection. Got a spark of intellectual friction. What about you, sister? Are you running or waiting? A shadow passed over her features so quick he almost missed it. We are all waiting, she said, her voice dropping a little. That is the nature of faith. Over the next few weeks, the Hermanas became a quiet feature of his new life. They would appear at the clinic for supplies, or he would see them at the market in San Pedro. Moving through the bustle of tourists and locals like figures from another time, he learned their names. Sor Anna, the matriarch. Sor Isabel, the intellectual. Sor Catalina, the young novice, whose shy smile was a small bright flower in the desert. And Sor Sophia, who tended their gardens and rarely spoke, but whose hands were always stained with the rich, dark earth of their oasis. They began to invite him to their cloister. At first, it was for medical reasons. Sor Anna had a persistent cough. So Sophia had arthritis in her hands. He would make the hour-long drive in his dusty jeep, down a dirt track that seemed to lead to nowhere, until he arrived at a high, ancient adobe wall with a single, heavy wooden door. The first time he stepped inside was like stepping into another dimension. The brutal, sun-blasted desert gave way to a lush, shaded courtyard. A spring, a miracle in this arid land, bubbled from a rock, feeding a network of stone channels that irrigated terraced gardens of vegetables, herbs, and flowers he had never seen before. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, of mint and something floral and intoxicating. The cloister itself was a labyrinth of simple, whitewashed rooms connected by open-air corridors. It was a place of profound, palpable peace. His visits became less medical and more personal. They would share their simple meals with him: quinoa stew, fresh bread baked in a clay oven, goat cheese from their own small herd. They would talk, rather they would listen. In the quiet of the courtyard, under a sky studded with more stars than he had ever imagined, Arthur found himself speaking of things he had locked away for years. He spoke of Eleanor, of the specific way she used to laugh, her head thrown back. He spoke of his career, the triumphs, and the crushing weight of responsibility. And one evening, his voice thick with unshed tears, he spoke of Lily. He told them about her sky-blue eyes, about the feel of her small, cold hand in his, about the godful, crushing silence of the operating room when he knew he had failed. He expected judgment or pity. He received neither. The four women listened with a deep, absorbent stillness. When he was done, his confession hanging raw in the cool night air, it was Sor Anna who spoke. "The body is a vessel, doctor," she said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes it is strong, and sometimes it is broken. It is not for us to command. You carry a great burden, a burden of pride. You believe you failed because you could not conquer death. But death is not the enemy. Silence is the end of life, the end of the story." He didn't understand what she meant, not fully, but the words soothed a wound in him he thought was fatal. They were offering him a different way of seeing the world, a release from the binary of success and failure, of life and death, that had defined and destroyed him. He felt himself being seduced, not by a woman, but by a state of being. The seduction of acceptance, the seduction of purpose, even if that purpose was not yet clear. He became a regular fixture at the cloister. He helped Sor Sophia in the garden, identifying the botanical names of her strange high-altitude herbs. He debated philosophy and history with Sor Isabel, who had been a university student in Santiago before she heard her calling. He found himself feeling a protective paternal affection for Sor Catalina, whose innocence was a balm. And he engaged in long, complex conversations with Sor Anna about faith, science, and the nature of existence. He was a scientist, a man of empirical evidence, yet he found their unwavering faith magnetic. It was a force, as real and as powerful as gravity. He was falling. And he didn't even realize it until the night they laid the choice before him. It was the night of a solstice, a date they held as sacred. They had prepared a special meal. The air was thick with the smoke from a resin he didn't recognize, a scent that was both earthy and sweet and slightly disorienting. They drank a wine made from strange local berries, dark and potent. Head felt light, his senses heightened. The stars in the courtyard seemed close enough to touch. After the meal, Sorena asked him to join her in the chapel. It was a small, circular room, its adobe walls bare except for a single, abstract carving in the wall, not a cross, but a spiral, like a galaxy or a seed unfurling. The four women stood in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by a single candle. Making them look like figures in a Caravaggio painting, Arthur Sorena began, using his first name for the first time. "We have not been entirely truthful with you." Knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. "This community was not founded on a simple dispute with Rome," she continued, her voice taking on a liturgical cadence. "It was founded on a prophecy. Our foundress, Mother Alara, was given a vision 150 years ago, a vision of the future. She saw the world growing old and barren, not through fire or flood, but through a great quiet, a sickness of the spirit that would lead to a sickness of the body. Humanity would forget how to create, it would lose its seed, its divine spark." Arthur stared at her, the strange wine buzzing in his veins. This was beyond esoteric doctrine. This was cult territory. Mother Alara was told that this place, this oasis, would be a sanctuary. An ark, not for two of every animal, but for the seed of humanity itself. And she was told that when the world was on the brink, when the silence was deafening, a man would come. A healer from the north, marked by loss. A man who understood the body's betrayal, who had fought death and seen its face. He would not be a man of our faith, but his soul would be searching for a purpose to fill the void within him. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. He would come to us from the land of the eagle, when the Southern Cross was at its highest point in the sky on the solstice. He would be a man in his winter years, his hands bearing the memory of saving lives and of losing them. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. It was a trick, story woven to fit his arrival. It had to be. The prophecy states that this Sembrador, the sewer, would be the vessel. He would help us fulfill our sacred duty, to carry the divine seed into the next age, to ensure that life does not fall into silence. He finally understood. The blood rushed back to his head, hot and shameful. He felt a wave of revulsion, and to his horror, a flicker of something else, a dizzying, terrifying thrill. They weren't just nuns, they were a breeding program, and they had chosen him as their stud. "You're insane," he whispered, the words sounding feeble in the resonant chapel. This is blasphemy. It's a perversion of everything you claim to believe." "Is it sore?" Isabel stepped forward, her usual skepticism gone, replaced by a fervent intensity. "What is more sacred than the creation of life? Your world, the world you fled, it worships death, sanitizes it, medicalizes it, hides it away in sterile rooms. It has forgotten the raw, messy, beautiful miracle of birth. We have not." "I'm 60 years old," he stammered. Pathetic defense. "The prophecy speaks of a man in winter," Sorena said calmly, "not a boy in spring. It requires wisdom and sorrow. Your sorrow, Arthur, is what makes you worthy. Your loss is what makes you whole enough to understand what must be preserved." He wanted to run, to get in his jeep and drive until he hit the ocean, to fly back to the sterile, predictable world he had abandoned. But he was paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their belief, and by something else. A question was waiting for him back there? An empty house? Bottle of whiskey? The ghost of a little girl he couldn't save? Here was a purpose so immense, so primal, it defied all conventional morality. They were offering him not just absolution for his past failure, but a chance to participate in an act of creation so profound it bordered on the divine. It was wrong. It was clinically, certifiably insane, and it was the most seductive thing he had ever encountered. He looked at the four of them. Sorena, the unyielding will. Sor Isabel, the converted intellectual. Sor Sophia, the silent earth mother. And Sor Catalina, young, innocent Sor Catalina, her eyes shining with a faith so pure it broke his heart. To her, this was not sex. It would be a sacrament. And honored his morality, the rigid framework of his entire life was cracking. The choice they presented was not between right and wrong. It was a choice between two different universes. The one he knew, filled with logical decay and quiet despair. And this one, governed by a beautiful, terrifying, and vital madness. They were asking him to save them, to save humanity, to save himself. And the price was the one thing he had left, his own soul. I can't, he said, his voice cracking. Sorena simply nodded, as if expecting this. The choice is yours, Arthur. We will not force you. But the prophecy is clear. You are the one. To refuse is to choose the silence. He stumbled out of the chapel and back to his jeep, his mind a maelstrom. He drove back to his small adobe hut in a daze, the desert landscape blurring past him. He didn't sleep. He sat with an unopened bottle of Pisco, staring at his own reflection. In the dark window. The man who stared back was a stranger, a hollowed-out shell. He thought of Lily. He had failed to give her more life. The Hermanas were offering him a chance to create it fourfold. A cosmic balancing of the scales. Terrible, beautiful, monstrous symmetry. The next day he drove back. He found them in the courtyard, working in their garden as if nothing had happened. He walked up to Sorana, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. If I do this, he said, his voice low and hoarse, it is not for your God. It is not for your prophecy, it is for my own reasons. Sorana looked up from the herb. She was tending, her eyes holding no triumph, only a deep, ancient knowing. God has many names, Arthur, and so do his reasons. The line between right and wrong did not blur. It simply ceased to exist. The world shrank to the high adobe walls of the cloister. The days took on a strange, ritualistic rhythm, divorced. From the outside world, Arthur moved his essential belongings from his hut into a small, simple room they had prepared for him. He was no longer a visitor. He was a resident, a participant. The ritual of seeding, as they called it, was not a sordid, lustful act. It was something far stranger, more disorienting. It was a ceremony, stripped of all personality, all ego. It took place in the chapel, on a bed of woven reeds laid before the spiral carving. The air was thick with the same intoxicating incense from the solstice dinner. There was chanting, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He was not Arthur Finch, doctor from Boston. He was the Sembrador. The women were not Anna, or Isabel, or Catalina, or Sophia. Their faces were veiled. Their touch was impersonal, reverent. It was an act of profound, dislocated intimacy. He was an instrument, a function. He performed his duty. With a sense of dreamlike detachment, his mind floating somewhere above the scene, an observer to his own unbelievable actions. He felt the roughness of their wool habits, smelled the scent of their clean, sun-baked skin, heard their soft, controlled breaths and the resonant silence. And in those moments, he was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of conflicting emotions, shame, profanity, and a strange, unsettling holiness. He was breaking every taboo of his former world, committing an act of serial adultery with 4 consecrated women, and yet it felt less like a sin and more like a solemn biological imperative, sacred task. The weeks that followed were a period of surreal domesticity. The ritual was not repeated. It was a singular event, timed, they said, to the alignment of the moon and their own bodies. Now, there was only waiting. Life in the cloister was peaceful, ordered. He fell into a routine that was both monastic and familial. He would work in the garden with Sor Sophia, her quiet presence a comfort. She communicated more with a glance or a touch of her earthy hand on his arm than most people did with a torrent of words. He learned that she had come to the cloister as a teenager, a refugee from a violent home in the slums of Santiago. For her, this place was not a prison. It was the only true sanctuary she had ever known. He continued his debates with Sor Isabel. But now they had a new, unspoken subtext. They argued about predestination and free will, and he knew they weren't just talking about theology. They were talking about him. Even if a path is laid out for you, she argued one afternoon, you still have to choose to walk it. The choice is what gives it meaning. He saw in her a mind that constantly tested the boundaries of her own faith. A faith she had chosen with the same fierce intellect she had once applied to her secular studies. He saw the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The two were in a constant, fascinating dialogue. With Sor Catalina, he developed a gentle, almost paternal bond. He would help her with her chores, mending the goat pen or clearing the irrigation channels. She was full of a simple, unadulterated joy that he found both intoxicating and terrifying. She would ask him about the world outside, about snow and skyscrapers and the ocean. Her innocence was absolute. He looked at her and saw a ghost of Lily, and the thought that he had planted his seed within her, that she might bear his child, was a weight so heavy it threatened to crush him. He felt a desperate, clawing need to protect her. Yet he was the very source of the cataclysm that was coming to her life. And then there was Sor Anna. Their relationship was the most complex. She was the matriarch, the keeper of the prophecy. He would sit with her in the evenings, and she would tell him the history of the sect, of the women who had come before, who had lived and died waiting for this moment, for his arrival. She spoke of it with such matter-of-fact certainty that he found his own skepticism eroding. Ground down by the sheer monolithic force of her belief, he was no longer just Arthur. He was a figure in her sacred story, a chapter she had been waiting. Her entire life too, right? There was no intimacy between them, not in the way he understood it, but there was a deep, unsettling bond. She was his guide, his confessor, and his jailer. He was living in a state of suspended reality, a man caught in the amber of a mad prophecy. He felt a peace he hadn't known was possible, a sense of belonging, of purpose, and yet a constant, low-level hum of horror thrummed beneath the surface. He was complicit in a grand delusion. He had lost his mind. He had found a home. The two thoughts were not contradictory. Then came the morning in the infirmary, the morning of the 4 blue crosses. The sight of them, stark and chemical and real, shattered the dreamlike state he had been living in. This was not a theological debate. This was not a spiritual journey. This was biology. This was consequence. For lives, for pregnancies, his children. The abstract had become terrifyingly concrete. His heart hammered in his chest as he looked at their serene faces. Their quiet joy a stark contrast to his own spiraling panic. They saw a miracle. He saw a catastrophe of his own making. The weeks that followed the confirmation were a new kind of surreal. The women's bodies began to change. The subtle swell of their abdomens beneath the rough wool. The new tenderness in their steps. Their focus turned inward to the lives they were nurturing. Arthur, the doctor, took over. He monitored their health, listened to their hearts, and the tiny, frantic flutters of the fetal hearts within them. He was their physician, their confidant, and the author of their condition, the father. The absurdity of it was a constant dizzying companion. He would feel the kick of a tiny foot through the wall of Sor Catalina's belly and be struck by a wave of paternal love so fierce it stole his breath. He would discuss nutrition and iron supplements with Sor Isabel, and for a moment they were just an expectant couple. He would watch Sor Sophia humming to herself as she weeded the garden, one hand resting on her bump, and see a vision of ancient, eternal motherhood. He was building a family. Strange, impossible, polygamous, blasphemous family. He was beginning to love them. Was falling for all of them, not in a romantic sense, but in a deeper, more entangled way. Their lives were now irrevocably his. Their fate was his. This fragile, bizarre paradise was not meant to last. The outside world, which he had so effectively banished, was about to come crashing through the adobe walls. It arrived in the form of a young priest from Santiago, Father Mateo. He was ambitious, zealous, a new breed of cleric tasked with rooting out heterodoxy and bringing stray flocks back to the fold. Rumors had reached the archbishop's office of a strange, isolated community of women, a secular American doctor living among them, whispers of strange rites. Mateo had been sent to investigate. He arrived unannounced, his black cassock and crisp Roman collar a slash of alien judgment against the earthy tones of the cloister. He found Arthur in the courtyard checking Sor Catalina's blood pressure. The sight of the visibly pregnant nun and the older American man, his hand on her arm, his stethoscope around his neck, was all the proof Matteo needed. His face, handsome and sharp, hardened into a mask of righteous fury. "In the name of God, what is happening here?" he demanded, his Spanish sharp and accusatory. The confrontation was brutal. It took place in the main hall, with the 4 pregnant women standing. Behind Arthur, a silent, solid wall of defiance. Father Matteo did not hold back. He called Arthur a predator, a charlatan, a wolf preying on a flock of lost, vulnerable sheep. He called the women heretics, blasphemers, victims of a monstrous manipulation. "These women are in a state of mortal sin," he spat, his eyes blazing. "They require confession and penance and protection. Once you..." He turned the full force of his venom on Arthur. "You will be reported to the authorities. For kidnapping, for abuse of your position as a doctor, for rape." The word hung in the air, ugly and obscene. Arthur looked at the women. At Sor Anna's stony resolve, Sor Isabel's intellectual contempt for this simplistic man, Sor Sophia's frightened stillness, and Sor Catalina's bewildered hurt. They were not victims. They were the architects of this entire reality, but the world would never see that. Matteo's version was the one that would make sense. It was the story that would stick. Matteo laid out his ultimatum. He would return in 1 week. He expected Arthur to be gone. He would arrange for the women to be taken to a proper convent in Santiago, where they would be cared for there. Condition handled with discretion. The implication was clear. Their children, the fruits of this unholy union, would be taken from them, given up for adoption. It's their scandalous origin erased. "I am saving their souls," Matteo declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "And I am saving them from you." When he was gone, a profound silence fell over the cloister. The peace was shattered. The outside world with its black and white morality had found them. Arthur felt the old despair creeping back in, cold and familiar. Matteo was right, wasn't he? By every law, every ethical code he had ever lived by, he was a monster. He had done a terrible thing. His duty now was to extricate himself, to let the system fix the problem he had created, even if it destroyed these women in the process. It was the logical, responsible thing to do. It's the right thing to do. He looked at Sor Catalina, who had started to weep silently, her hands protectively wrapped around her belly. He saw Sor Sophia, her face pale with a terror that spoke of a past trauma he could only guess at, of being helpless and having her life dictated by others. He saw the fire in Sor Isabel's eyes, a defiant fury, and he saw Sor Anna watching him, her expression unreadable, but her posture unwavering. They were not waiting for him to save them from himself. They were waiting for him to choose a side. In that moment, something shifted in him. It was a tectonic plate of the soul. His whole life had been about following the rules, about protocols and ethics and the established order. And where had it gotten him? To a hollowed-out life and a bottle of scotch? He had failed Lily by following the rules, by admitting defeat when the established protocols ran out. He had come here to escape that world, and now that world had come to claim him too. Submit to Father Matteo would be the ultimate act of cowardice. It would be a betrayal, not just of the women, but of the strange, vital, insane purpose he had found here. It would be choosing the silence Sor Anna had spoken of. He had to make a decision, not for his own salvation, but for theirs. Be a decision that would damn him forever in the eyes of the world. A lie so profound it would rewrite reality, an unforgivable act to protect an impossible truth. He spent the next few days in a fever of activity. He used the clinic's satellite internet, a fragile link to his old life. He called in favors he hadn't thought of in a decade. He contacted a lawyer he knew in Boston, a man who specialized in the creative establishment of nonprofits and foundations. He drained the last of his considerable savings. He worked with an intensity he hadn't felt since his surgical residency, fueled by coffee and a terrifying, clarifying sense of purpose. When Father Mateo returned, exactly 1 week later, Arthur was ready. He met him at the gate, but not alone. The 4 women stood with him, no longer behind him, but beside him, and he held a sheaf of papers in his hand. Father Arthur said, his voice calm and steady, "I understand your concern, but you are mistaken about the nature of this community." He handed the priest the documents. They were beautifully, professionally forged, flown in by courier from Santiago just that morning. There were incorporation papers for the Atacama lay community for holistic living. There were mission statements, printed on crisp letterhead, speaking of ecological sustainability and spiritual wellness, using a jargon so thick with New Age platitudes that it was impenetrable. There were signed affidavits from all 4 women, their signatures clear and strong, stating that they were willing participants in a sociological experiment in alternative family structures. Under the guidance of Dr. Arthur Finch, a respected sociologist and philanthropist, he had even backdated articles and blog posts. Creating a digital footprint for a fiction, Mateo read the papers, his brow furrowed in confusion. This was not the simple case of abuse he had expected. This was paperwork, bureaucracy, legality. "This is absurd," he stammered. "Is it?" Arthur countered, borrowing Sor Isabel's line. "It is a registered lay community, operating with the full consent of its members. They are not nuns. They have not taken vows recognized by your church for almost 100 years. They are free women, Father, and you have no authority here." He let that hang in the air. "In fact, your continued harassment could be seen as a violation of their religious freedom. I'm sure the Chilean courts would be very interested in that." He was bluffing, but his voice carried the absolute conviction of a man with nothing left to lose. He was burning the bridge back to his old world, dousing it in gasoline and throwing a match. Mateo was thrown. He was a man of dogma and hierarchy. He knew how to fight sin. He didn't know how to fight a nonprofit foundation. He looked from the papers to Arthur's hard, unyielding face, to the 4 pregnant women standing beside him, their expressions serene and united. He saw that he had lost. His black and white world had no purchase here. "You will answer to God for this," he finally said, his voice laced with impotent fury. "I imagine I will," Arthur replied quietly, "but not today." The priest turned and walked away, his stiff, angry back a retreating shadow against the vastness of the desert. The wooden gate closed behind him, the sound of the bolt sliding home, echoing in the courtyard. It was the sound of a cage door closing, but Arthur couldn't tell if he was on the inside or the outside. He had won. He had protected them. It made his choice, his unforgivable decision. He had chosen their beautiful madness over the world's ugly sanity. He had become the guardian of the prophecy. In the quiet that followed, Soriana placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it felt as heavy as an anchor. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a profound, unshakable peace, "you are truly one of us." He felt no triumph, only the cold, terrifying certainty that he could never go back. He was home in the months that followed. As the women's bellies grew round and full under the desert sun, a fragile peace settled over the cloister. The lie Arthur had told became their reality. They were no longer the Hermanas de la Divina Simiente, but the Atacama lay community. The fiction became a shield, protecting the strange, sacred truth at its core. Arthur embraced his role as guardian. He managed their limited finances, dealt with the occasional government official who came by, meticulously maintained the legal fiction he had created. He was a liar, a forger, a shepherd of heretics. He had never felt more alive. His bond with the women deepened into a complex, multifaceted love. It was the practical love of a husband, the protective love of a father, the collaborative love of a co-conspirator. He was bound to them not by vows or by lust, but by a shared, radical act of creation. One evening, as he and Sorena sat in the quiet coolness of the chapel, she did something she had never done before. She led him to a small locked chest in a niche behind the altar. From it, she removed a heavy leather-bound book. It was the journal of Mother Alara, the foundress, written in a spidery 11th century script. "I think you are ready to see this," she said, her voice soft. To truly understand, he'd assumed the prophecy she'd told him was an oral tradition, something passed down and embellished over the generations. He thought they had seen his arrival and molded the story to fit, a classic case of confirmation bias. But as he opened the book, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, he saw it was all there. It's written in faded iron gall ink more than a century ago. He read of the vision of a barren world. He read of the sanctuary in the desert. And then his blood ran cold. He read the description of the sembrador. Vendrá del norte, un sanador de la carne corrupta. He will come from the north, a healer of corrupt flesh, an oncologist. The specificity was chilling. Final inverno de su vida, con 60 ecos de carga. In the winter of his life, with 60 years of burden, his exact age, he kept reading. His hands beginning to tremble. Prophecy described the healer's loss, the ghost of a child he could not save. It described the deep wound in his soul that would drive him to the ends of the earth. And then he saw the passage that made the world tilt on its axis. Tendrá una marca en su mano izquierda, una cicatriz de su infalma, de media luna. He will have a mark on his left hand, a scar from his childhood, in the shape of a half-moon. Arthur instinctively looked down at his own left hand. There it was. The faint silvery crescent on his palm, a scar he'd gotten falling from a tree when he was 7 years old. A detail so specific, so personal, so impossible. He felt a wave of vertigo, the chapel walls seeming to close in on him. His choices, his desperate flight from Boston, his random discovery of the clinic on the internet, his journey into the desert, had any of it been his own? Or had he been moving along a preordained track pulled by invisible strings of destiny woven 150 years ago? He turned the page, his heart hammering. The final entry about the sembrador was short, single sentence. Mother Alara wrote that she did not know the man's name, but that the spirit had given her a sound, a title for him. Su nombre, Siracomo, el Dun, Pajaro Cantor, Arturo el Pinzon. Name will be like that of a songbird. The finch. Arthur dropped the book. The sound echoed in the silent chapel. Arturo el Pinzon. Arthur Finch. He looked up at Sorana, whose face was calm and passive, beatific. She had known, they had all known. They hadn't just been hoping he was the one. They weren't just interpreting a vague prophecy. They were waiting for him, specifically. For him, grand, desperate, life-altering decisions to come here, to stay, to perform the ritual, to lie to the priest had not been choices at all. They were simply him, playing a part that was written for him long before he was born. The power dynamic he thought he understood, the one where he, the worldly man, held a strange sway over these isolated women, was a complete illusion. He was not their savior. He was their specimen. He had not chosen them. He had been summoned. The seduction was a lie. The moral dilemma was a lie. His entire sense of agency, of making a defiant, world-burning choice, evaporated into the thin, high-altitude air. He was a pawn in their divine chess game, a tool, a vessel. Just as they were, he looked at Soriana at the profound ancient certainty in her eyes, and he finally understood the true nature of their faith. It was not a hopeful, questioning thing. It was a force as patient and as implacable as the desert itself. And he was caught in it, utterly and completely. The seasons turned in the desert, marked not by falling leaves, but by the shifting angle of the relentless sun. Booze! The births came, one after another, in the spring. For healthy babies, their cries. Echoing in the ancient cloister, a sound of such shocking vitality it seemed to make the very stones vibrate. 2 boys, 2 girls. Arthur, the doctor, delivered them all, his hands, which had once failed to keep a child in the world. Now the first 2 welcomed 4 new ones into it. His life found its final, strange and permanent shape. He was the padre. Sembrador, the sewer father. He was Arturo. He was the patriarch of this impossible family, this holy, monstrous creation. He taught the women how to care for the infants, the practical medical side of things that their prophecy hadn't covered. He sterilized bottles, treated diaper rash, and listened for the signs of colic. He was a father 4 times over, a grandfather by age. He would sit in the courtyard in the late afternoons, the setting sun painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, and hold one of the babies. He would look into a tiny, perfect face and see a shadow of his own features, mingled with sore Catalina's wide eyes or sore Isabel's determined brow. He felt a love so profound, so elemental, it dwarfed everything that had come before. It was a love born of madness and prophecy, of lies and faith, of profound transgression and sacred duty. He found peace in the rhythm of their lives, the daily chores, the quiet meals, the soft gurgles of the infants, the serene, fulfilled smiles of the 4 mothers. They treated him with a mixture of reverence and familiar affection. He was both a holy figure in their mythology and the man who knew how to burp a baby. But his peace was a fragile thing, thin layer of soil over a chasm. He could never escape the knowledge of the journal, the knowledge that his life was not his own. He was loved, he was needed, he was revered, and he was trapped. Trapped by a prophecy, trapped by his own actions, trapped by a love he could not renounce. He was their savior, and he was their property one evening. As the 4 women sat together, nursing their children in the twilight, they shared a look. It was a glance of such deep, shared understanding, of such perfect, seamless unity, that, for the first time, he understood that he would always be outside of it. He was the catalyst, the instrument, the necessary other. But the circle they formed, the circle of mothers and children, of true believers, was complete without him. He was essential, and he was extraneous. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the infirmary window. He saw an old man with sun-weathered skin and tired eyes, holding a child. The man from Boston, the one who lived in a tomb of his own making, was gone. He didn't know who this new man was. He only knew that he had come to the end of the world to lose himself, and he had succeeded more profoundly than he could ever have dared to imagine. The silence he had feared was gone, replaced by the cries of new life. And yet he had never felt so alone.